This is the Physical Activity Researcher Podcast, a podcast for researchers of sedentary behavior, physical activity, and sports. Join for a relaxed dialogue about research design, practicalities, and, well, anything related to research. Learn from your fellow researchers useful and relevant information that does not fit into formal content and limited space of scientific publications. And here is your host.
Welcome everyone. This is the Meaningful Sport podcast, and I am your host, Noora Ronkainen. Meaningful Sport is a series of discussions on the why and how involvement in sport and physical activity can be an important part of a life worth living. If you are interested in the theme, you might also want to check out meaningfulsport.com. There you can find podcast show notes, read a blog, and access many resources for further explorations of meaningful sport. Today we will be discussing career narratives of athletes from underserved communities. I'm delighted to have Rob Book from the University of Southern Denmark discussing this topic with me. Rob is working on a PhD project titled Empowering Youth Athletes Against the Odds: Athletic Talent Development Environments in Underserved Communities. In the podcast show notes, you will find links to the recent articles published from the project. And besides the research, Rob has extensive experience of working as a teacher and a coach in one of the most challenging school districts in the United States. We will be discussing some of these experiences also today. So welcome to the podcast, Rob, and thanks for finding the time for our conversation.
No problem, Noora. Thank you for having me.
You just sent me the prologue of your PhD dissertation a week ago, and when I was reading that, I was like, oh my God, how can somebody work in this kind of environment? And you describe your experience as a teacher and a coach in this school where you have guns, gangs, drugs, and crime all over the place. And I was just wondering how you have survived that environment. And you also described that was certainly not the easiest job you've had in your life. So maybe we can start discussing this background and the work you've done before becoming a researcher.
Yeah, I think that it's very relevant for my background, for my research, because that it's my experiences as a coach and a teacher in this inner city high school that I think it was statistically located in the 8th highest crime rate neighborhood in the U.S. And so my time there is sort of what fueled my passion to research this topic. And I think it's helped me become a better researcher because I really care about the project, and the research really means a lot to me because of the time and the effort, and a big part, 25% of my life was spent working within this school. And, was it challenging? Absolutely. The stress, that came with it for me on a professional level was to the point where it was actually physical health ailments, stress-related physical health, heart-related issues that actually, in the prime of my life forced me to leave because my body couldn't operate in that environment much longer. So I have absolute admiration for teachers and coaches who can do that for 30, 35 years. I did the time that I could, and then I had to move on, and that was part of my journey, was to move on through there. But I hold my time at the school is one of the most important and meaningful things that I've ever done. But to consider the fact, on the one hand, working there, of course, was a challenge, but I got to go home every day, and to think about the students that I serviced, mostly they were high school ages, so 14, 15 years old till 18. They just walked out the door, maybe walked a couple hundred meters to their home, and that their environment was entirely this challenging, underserved community. It wasn't I got to leave and go away, and a lot of them never did. And it's hard to believe it unless you're in it and see it. I don't think about it sometimes a lot in my normal life. But then when I wrote that prologue to my thesis that I sent to you, and you were the first person actually to read it, all of these things come back into my mind, and I just think, my God, like this reality for these people, these kids, is it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right that you certainly stood out by being pretty much the only white person around and coming from this very different family background and different reality, as you put it. You go home and you will have a very different life outside of the school, whereas this is very much the reality where the young children live also, like their whole life and not just the school day.
Yes.
So yeah, that's really quite an experience. If you think of how you started that work and what pushed you to do that, even if I'm sure you were aware that will be extremely challenging.
It's an interesting question, and I actually reflected about this lots of times. And I think the beginning of it probably, well, part of it came, my mom kept some things of when I was little, and I remember there was a project I think I had to do for school when I was 8 or 9 years old. And okay, what do you want to do when you grow up? And I always said I wanted to be a teacher. I said that at 8 or 9 years old. So part of it always was that I wanted to be a teacher. Sports was a big part of my life. So coaching and being a physical education teacher was part of what I wanted to do. But I did not end up in such an underserved school by accident. That was an intentional choice, and I think it goes a lot to my upbringing with my parents. And my father was a minister growing up in a Lutheran church, and service work was always a very important part of his life and my mother's life. And once he retired formally from the ministry up in Canada, him and my mother moved to Atlanta specifically to open up a homeless outreach ministry, which they did for, I think, 8 or 9 years. So they were always working with marginalized and oppressed groups of people, and I spent summer working with them. And I guess it's just been ingrained in me to use some of the blessings and gifts that I've been given in my life, and to try to use my life in a service-oriented way. So that is why I particularly chose to work in an inner city underserved school, which, you know, I think in your mind, maybe you think it's going to be one way, and then the reality comes. And in some ways, I mean, it was absolutely amazing. It was just amazing. The relationships I still have to this day with my former students were incredible. But then in other ways, it was more challenging than I ever could have imagined. I think certainly culturally, as you touched upon, being, you know, there was a handful of white teachers. I think in my time there, 8 years, I saw one white student the entire time. It was 99.5% African American or Black students, and a small Hispanic population. So making that cultural transition actually was a big one. I never really thought, you know, I lived in Thailand before and France and different places, and by comparison, that was a lot easier than it was for me just driving, you know, 3 kilometers to the school from where I lived. That was the hardest cultural transition I've ever had to make, doing that.
Yeah. And we'll talk a bit later about your research.
Sure.
And you've also looked at this cultural transition part in these athletes' journeys who come from these underserved communities. You mentioned that this work, even if it was challenging, it was something that was very meaningful for you. And when we are talking about meaning and meaningfulness in this podcast, it would be nice to also reflect on how you view the role of sport and physical education in these young people's lives. Do you think that was maybe something that brought some meaning to their lives?
Yes, it absolutely did. And I think that, you know, some of my research, I suppose, at this moment it does focus a little bit more on the elite sport aspect, but was never really my primary focus or interest, even, and especially not when I was teaching and coaching at my old school. The philosophy of all of the teachers that were there was, given just the challenging environments that these students lived in, sports, we knew sports was a way to keep them focused positively on something else, gave them something to look forward to, gave them structure, taught them a lot of things that might be the only thing that they have in their day, to be honest, to keep them from making some poor decisions. And it wasn't only sports. Sports was just one way. It just needed to be something. Could have been music. It could have been a book or journal club. It could have been anything, theater, arts. It was a very intentional function of our school, was to have programs in place for that purpose. And I know with my students, especially with my athletes, keeping them involved in my program was pivotal for a lot of them. But at the same time, getting these young athletes and to buy into the concept of what it meant to be part of a team was sometimes the hardest part. As I mentioned, I think in the prologue that you read, the most talented athletes, most of the time I couldn't even get them to come to practice. I couldn't get them to buy into the team concept. So a lot of the time it's almost some of the ones with the most talented and brightest futures never even discovered that avenue, which was always a little bit sad.
Yeah. What would be some of those memories from that time? Or your research is a lot about stories. What would be, let's pick one story of one student and who you worked with that is something that is important for you and
well, I think
from that time.
I think the important one, and I guess the reason it came to my mind in the prologue that I've written that you read was about my two former athletes, and I think it's a meaningful story, and it goes towards the very first game that I ever coached. So I'm 40 now, I think, so I would have been maybe at the time, maybe I was 30 years old, and I just started the first year as a full-time physical education teacher and coach at the school. And I was coaching the junior varsity team, which would have been kids 15, 16 years old. And so I had my team. We were training in the fall and making great progress. And our first game was going to be an away game, and it was going to be against the strongest team in the city. It was a high school that was in a very affluent area. Lots of money, lots of resources. And they were always historically, we just knew it was going to be a tough game. So, my father was my assistant coach at the time because I had nobody to help me, and he was just generous enough to dedicate all of his time when I was there. He was my assistant coach in every sport I coached and was always like the team father. So it was great to have him as a part of, my journey and my time there. So anyway, we're driving to the game and on the team bus, and our players are all excited, and they think they're gonna beat them. And I'm just thinking, okay, I hope the game is just close. That was my only hope. So we go to the locker room before the game. I talk to them, and I put the jerseys in the middle of the floor of the locker room in a Tupperware box, and me and my dad walk out of the locker room for a couple minutes just to talk about what should I say in the pregame speech. And all of a sudden we hear some yelling, shouting coming from within the locker room. We run in, and the whole team is huddled around each other. They all stop, and apparently there was a fight between my two best players. My point guard and the center got in a fist fight, and they were friends, but they got in a fight because they both wanted the same jersey number. And so there I am as a first-year coach, my first game, and in my context of what I played sports, this stuff this didn't happen. No one prepared me for this. What do you do when you're playing your first game and your two best players get in a fight in the locker room? I had no idea what to do, so I had to do something, and I ultimately told them they weren't going to dress for the game. They left. We ended up getting beat by 50 points. It was embarrassing. for everybody involved, the team, it was just totally psyched out. And so the reason I tell the story is because the two players that were involved, because of what happened afterwards, was so telling of what the outcomes were for these two athletes. So the point guard, his mother so she met with me the next day, and I explained to her what I was going to do, and I said that I wanted to kick him off the team, and she was begging and pleading that this was the only thing he had. So I said, okay. I said, if he comes to practice every day and practices with us every day, I'll give him his jersey back and he can play after Christmas break. Give the same deal to the other player, the center. And basically what happens was the center, he came maybe to a couple practices and then he just disappeared. He just left, transferred schools, and I never heard from him again until I saw him on the news committing an armed robbery in his local community with a gun, and likely, as far as I know, will probably be in jail the rest of his life for that crime. The point guard, as far as I know, I mean, it was a hard 4 years for him in high school. I talked to his mother all the time, sometimes almost every day, just trying to make sure he was focused. I was sort of her eyes into his life, and he graduated and he went on to college, and his life is, from what I can just tell, very, very different. So I tell that story because it just shows how the fine line between how these two young men, how their lives turned out. And if the one boy, maybe if I hadn't, so I think all the time about, should I have tried harder with the other kid that I kicked off the team? Should I have kept him? Should I have worked to keep him? Because his decision him not playing had these ultimate repercussions, and it was hard to live with that. And I think about that stuff a lot now, even as 10 years later.
Yeah, it must have been a very powerful experience. And what you then talked about your research, and I mean, our personal experience is certainly shaping what we find as worthy topics of research. Yeah, let's then move on from this personal story to this research context. So
Sure.
You stopped working at the school and you carry all these memories and these doubts in your head. So maybe share a little bit about how you then framed your research topic and research questions and what you wanted to achieve with this PhD research.
Right. Yeah. So then ultimately, when I decided to do the PhD, I really wanted. I preferred I just preferred the European model of a PhD towards the US or Canadian one. I liked the University of Southern Denmark, and my supervisors, Christopher Henriksen, who's here, and Natalia Stambolova, who is at Halmstad, are just, two of the best in the world at athletic talent development environments and looking at career pathways for Natalia at Halmstad. And I realized they were just going to be great people to guide me through this. And I also wanted to remove myself a bit from the situation. So I geographically was sort of farther away and could look at this problem from a different perspective. So the project itself was a career pathway project, where the first part was where I interviewed 10 professional athletes who came from similar, comparable, low socioeconomic, underserved upbringings, but were able to make it to the top of professional sports. So that was the criteria. It ended up sort of through snowball sampling that they all ended up being black athletes. 8 of them played basketball and 2 were NFL football. Then the stories were ultimately just so compelling that's when we delved into this narrative investigation, which wasn't part of the project, nor was the cultural transition project that I also had worked on. Then
Right.
as it developed, the second part, which I'm moving quite almost completed with now, where I wanted to get stakeholders' perspectives on what they thought about these underserved athletic talent development environments, what I call UATDEs, and to get their perspective. And so we talked to people who worked in similar environments that I did. We went all the way to the top and talked to some NFL and NBA coaches to get their perspectives on sort of what this means. And then the last part was what I'm working on now, is actually a case study where I went into an urban community college back in the U.S. in a large urban area, and I'm doing a case study. So basically, my whole concept is that, and this is what goes with my supervisor's holistic ecological approach to athletic talent development, is that the entire environment in which someone lives impacts that talent environment. So it's not just what goes on in the gym or in the ice rink or on the field. It's the surrounding area also can impact what goes on within a sporting environment. And we see that. I saw that every day in my work. And what I'm starting to realize, especially from the stakeholders we talk to, is that the sports piece is very important, and you want the athletes. You need the specialized training to work with them, but they've all said, and this is my personal opinion, is that unless you deal with the social and the psychological challenges that come from living in these underserved environments, the sports stuff is secondary, because you can't, like I had described before, I couldn't get the best athletes to even join my team. So what does it matter how good they are or how much sports skill I have and knowledge if I can't get them there and make them psychologically feeling safe to a point where I can move from there. So I think that's a big piece of my research that I'm trying to bring to light and trying to flesh out a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so important work. And we already had, like, if we think of research on athletes' careers, we have like several decades of research as well, and a lot of work on these pathways. But at least I haven't seen this work on athletes that come from these underserved communities. So is your project almost like the first of its kind, or do we have something on this for you to build upon?
Well, I think if you were to ask somebody else, perhaps Natalia or Christopher, they would say that I'm the first one to look at this. I don't think that's maybe. I think that it just makes me feel uncomfortable saying something like that. But I think that there's Massey and Williams have done quite a few studies recently where they've looked at it a little bit differently, not so much in an athletic talent development environment perspective, but they looked at underserved and traumatic environments in the U.S. and a lot of these have been published in the QRSE has published a couple, and they're looking at things similar about how trauma can sort of impact development, but a different way, not in a sports specific way, in a career pathway way. So I do draw draw upon their research quite a bit, because they also made this connection talking about social capital and how sports within these underserved communities, it can be a great way to extend that, the social cultural capital, if you're looking at sort of Bourdieu's social theory. And then I think that there have been some other studies that I also draw upon a lot. I draw upon the Komatova study, where she interviewed some professional European basketball coaches and talking about their perspectives working with multicultural teams. And a lot of that focus was upon these coaches, mostly European, dealing with American, often Black, European basketball players, and some of the stereotypes that they would have, and different kind of positives and negatives, I suppose, or strengths and weaknesses of integrating these teams. So I look upon that a lot. But yeah, overall, this is sort of a little bit of a new area, and a lot of it though comes to, if you look at the studies that are available in a European context of athletic talent development and career pathway research. I mean, it's everywhere, especially in the Nordic countries. Yourself, you've done a lot of research in this way. Tatiana Ruba, and there's tons of stuff out there. But if you go into the U.S. context, it's like it's sort of given their philosophy of athletic talent development, which is sort of this talent identification where you have just mass participation at the bottom, and then the top people, the Olympic Committee and these professional teams, of course, are very organized in the way they develop their talent, but they're not so concerned about how it's developing or how these athletes are being supported when they're 10, 12, 15 years old. It doesn't really matter, because in that kind of model, the top athletes will eventually get there. So there's just nothing there. I haven't been able to find any kind of qualitative studies that look at athletic environments specifically within an American context in general, let alone within an underserved perspective.
Right. Yeah, so no doubt there is going to be a lot of novelty and value of your work also expanding on this diversity of pathways, and there is a big trend of emphasizing cultural issues when we look at athlete development, that, you know, different cultural contexts have different practices, and we have different structural conditions, and I mean, in the Nordic countries, when you look at talent programs and athlete talent development, I mean, most of the athletes who are in these programs are typically middle class white athletes.
Right.
So yeah. So let's talk about us as qualitative researchers. We are very aware of this relationship that we develop with our research participants, and the difficulty of understanding the other person's world, especially if we are living in quite different worlds. And one of your articles is also starting with this remark that you as a researcher are sitting in your office in Denmark, and you are doing this interview with an athlete in the US who is living in a completely different social and cultural context. So how was it for you to develop this relationship with your participants and trust, and having them to share all their stories with you?
Yeah, I think that is such a good question, and it's something that I reflected upon a lot. And I think, first of all, I will say that without the experiences that I had in teaching and in coaching and in that environment, if I didn't have that, I don't think there was any way I could have interviewed and conversed the way that I did in these interviews with my participants, because it just gave me a comfort, a knowledge, and, you know, an understanding of maybe at least what their experiences are like. So the word I basically come to is empathy, because, you know, of course I don't know what it's like to wake up in their shoes. I don't know what it's like to be in anybody's shoes except for my own. But it doesn't mean that I can't empathize and feel that I have a decent understanding of their experience. And I think that there's something about that must have made my participants feel comfortable, because, and maybe part of it is just my personality. I think being with people, talking to people, that is what's very important to me, and it's what I live for. And so maybe they could feel that, but I know that, like, the biggest way I can say that I knew I was able to build trust was how afterwards. So it's not like I've lost touch with a lot of these people. Like, they've connected with me on social media. They wish me happy birthday. They'll send me messages, comment on a picture when I had the birth of my son. You know, they're there in my life, and I think it just feels like it almost feels like they knew that, because I at least was a coach before also, that I sort of understood their world a little bit because of where I coached. And so I think it made them comfortable that we share that understanding. Whereas if I didn't have that, I think it would have been pretty tough for me to gain that. So I guess, of course, I'm not an insider, but the knowledge did help, I think, is about the best answer I can give. Yeah.
And you also told them about your previous work as a coach and a teacher in this community.
Yes.
So.
And I would say though too, if people are looking for, say, specific tips or something, you know, what I did was I felt I started out using like a semi-structured interview guide, and I realized it just didn't work. You could tell when I asked the questions, the changes in the turns, it just didn't strike them as natural. And I didn't think, so I switched very quickly to just an unstructured interview. And I started, you know, and I always started by telling them, about my life and what I did and my experience and why I'm doing what I'm doing. And then I just offered them to just tell me about their life. Tell me about yourself. Tell me your most important thing. And I got some very interesting responses, and the conversation went so well. It's almost hard for me to go back to some kind of structured interview format, because I just feel that it's just more genuine and sincere when I do it this way.
Yeah. And you mentioned that kind of this narrative analysis approach was not something that you necessarily started with, but was it something that became like more and more appealing as you went along with your interviewing?
Yes, and I think that so the narrative was sort of funny because so I think my supervisor was quite shocked and surprised at the data that I was getting through these interviews. For the first, I interviewed these 10 athletes, and he was just reading them, and it just, to me, I think it seems so striking in the contrast between the data that he would get when he would interview some of his, say, elite sailors or the elite orienteers. They were very short, not very descriptive, just not overly interesting is what he would say. And then he saw these stories and these interviews that went on for ages, and he just said, well, you need to do a narrative. And he said, it'll be easy. Well, that wasn't the case whatsoever. It was the opposite of easy, I think. But it was fascinating to learn about stories and the available, obviously I talked a lot with one of the best, Brett Smith, and got a lot of guidance and insight from his work and from conversations with him. And found it very interesting that how they sort of framed their life as, this, as you had even mentioned, what was it, like this sort of rags to riches or overcoming, the odds kind of narrative, which I entitled a sink or swim narrative, which I drew from some older work. Amy Liebluck, I'm going to pronounce that wrong. I think it was 1994. She had that idea.
Yeah, right. So stories are all over the place. Your personal story, your research participant story. I thought it was so interesting when you said that for your supervisor, these stories that you were hearing were so interesting and different from the stories that he has heard from the athletes that he has interviewed. So let's talk a little bit about what stands out in these stories that you heard. What are the parts that you find the most fascinating or interesting?
I think that's a tough question to answer. I think there's a lot of things that, I mean, they were compelling and deeply moving, and of course, I would gain just a massive appreciation. I was just in awe of what they were, of almost like what the human being can endure if that's what they're forced to navigate through. They're dealt a certain hand, and they were just able to keep persevering, to keep moving forward in and despite some extremely challenging circumstances. So you would hear things, when I would ask them, okay, tell me about the most significant moment of your life. So one athlete said, he was born, he met his dad 2 times. He was born when his dad was in jail for murder. Never saw him after that. Another athlete said, when I was 12 years old, my mother just up and abandoned me and left him alone in Detroit by himself at 12 years old. And so you just think, and I look at my experience with, loving parents and a warm environment, and then you just think about how every life is different and how some people's lives are just so much more challenging. And so you look at all of these things that, they have different circumstances and how they were able to still make it through. I think they were big. They all had people. They had different things different events got them out of that environment. For instance, a lot of them were gifted athletically. They were tall, they were strong, and so they were seen maybe at 15 years old and given a scholarship to a private school, moving them out of their community. So you think about, okay, if they weren't good at sports, that never would have happened. So you think about all of the other children and kids who are maybe just very gifted in other ways, but they're not going to get this free pass, this free opportunity to better their life in that way. There was a lot of luck involved. Every single one of these athletes had opportunities, many of them, where they could have been killed or could have ended up in jail. One guy told me that he was around 15 and him and his friends were all committing these armed robberies all the time. And the only reason that he didn't get caught when his other two friends did was because he happened to be at basketball practice that day, and they all went to jail for like 10 years. So there was some luck, of course, that's in anybody's life, but there was a lot of big luck moments. And then I think that some things that came out of these stories was, I guess, the way then, and this goes back and then to your narrative question that I think you want to maybe touch upon a little bit, is the way that they described their life story it wasn't this high performance narrative that you often see in research. You see Carlos and Douglas are very popular with that particular narrative, where you see it in a lot of other studies where a lot of these elite athletes, like their whole life is focused entirely around being the best in sports, and they sacrifice relationships and all sorts of things to become the best. That just wasn't anything that came within what I heard. And so what came was this sink or swim, whereby they had many opportunities where they could have sank to the bottom. Lives could have gone a lot different, but they were able to keep moving forward and eventually made it to the top. But that narrative is interesting because, so when I was writing that paper and was going through the revision process, my initial draft had it that I said something that it was surprising that this was the narrative. Well, one of the reviewers said, he or she said, actually, this is very unsurprising because this is the narrative that is in the American sporting context. You go anywhere on TV, you see exposés about the athlete who was poor, and now all of a sudden they beat the odds and now they're successful. Like, Americans love that. They love that story. So that's the interesting thing I think about narrative, is we use these available frameworks to sort of frame our experiences. And I think it's a really good example of that was a very available narrative for them in a very unsurprising way. And I think I actually agree now that it was a very unsurprising way that they would talk about their lives like that.
Yeah, that was a very good spot on by the reviewer to point it out. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so important for us to keep developing and discussing and also challenging this narrative typology in sport. That certainly it has helped us a lot in thinking about athletes' careers and this work on performance, discovery, and relational narrative by Carlos and Douglas. Mm-hmm. So that's been like a very helpful framework for us to think about career narratives. But yeah, so as researchers, it's always we're always a little bit hesitant to say which narrative is a good narrative and, that one is a bad narrative. But maybe you can reflect a little bit on what are the possibilities and what are the possible problems with this sink or swim narrative. Is it a good story for you to tell?
Yeah, I think, and this is what I sort of thought, and I'm glad you gave me this question before we talked, gave me a little chance to reflect yesterday about it. And I think that, the positive, I think, is that it does, in a way, I suppose, it keeps giving people some kind of hope that they could possibly get a better life experience in some kind of capacity. So it's like, if I look at all the students that I worked with in service all those years, and I always would hear them talk, I'm going to be an NBA player, I'm going to be an NFL player, I'm going to be a professional rapper, or whatever. It's like they all had these dreams, and a lot of them were very grandiose dreams and unrealistic dreams. But I feel that in that environment, for so many of them, when there is so little hope, you need to have some kind of hope to know that it is possible in some way. So I suppose that would be the positive spin. But when I look at it from the other, is it not a good narrative? Well, it would be really great in this world if we didn't have to have that kind of narrative, because it really negates like a lot of these like social and political forces that place so many people in oppressed positions in the first place. So it's like if we were in, if you look at a country like Denmark or Finland or somewhere like that, are there going to be as many rags to riches kind of sink or swim narratives? Probably not, because not as many people are in that disadvantaged position to begin with. So I think that's a little bit of the sad part. And also, I also find another part of it that's a little bit dangerous is that, it's nice, I interviewed 10 10 athletes who all had this typology and, they made it to the top of their sport, and that's great. But what about every 100 or every 1,000 other people just like them that didn't make it? What happened to them? The guy on my player who ended up doing the armed robbery, who had the talent. He's one of the best players I ever coached. And, what about them? So it's a little bit sad to think about that as well. So those are some of my reflections about that narrative.
Yeah, I think already what you also mentioned about the stories that you heard in the research context, that, so many points in these people's lives, in these athletes' lives, where they could have easily sank.
Mm-hmm.
And these moments when they could have ended up in prison for 10 years, but they were happening to be in the basketball practice.
Right.
And these moments of luck. So I think that's always the danger. And also in your research, you are showing these stories of the people who made it, who
Mm-hmm.
became elite athletes. But just like you say, we can always ask how many of these young people are there who had the same ambition, but they didn't make it. So, yeah.
Right.
Thanks for joining us this week on Physical Activity Researcher Podcast. If you like the show, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing or following the show on Twitter. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for your support. If you found value in the show, we would really appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you're using. Or if you would, in a real old school way, simply tell a friend about the show. It would be a great help for us. We have a fantastic lineup of guests for forthcoming episodes, so be sure to tune in. Thank you all for your support and have a great day.